The man they banished. They didn't send him to prison. They sent him away, away from his home, away from his people, away from everything he knew, because Erik had become too dangerous to remain in Iceland. He had been involved in killings. His enemies wanted him gone, and Iceland's laws gave him no place to hide. So Erik did something that would change history. He climbed aboard a Viking ship and sailed west, into waters where almost nobody from his world had dared to go. He was looking for land. What he found was a frozen wilderness. And somehow he decided to make it home. His name was Erik the Red, the son of an outlaw. Erik's story began long before Greenland. He was born in Norway. His father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, had been forced to leave Norway after being involved in a killing. The family eventually settled in Iceland, and there, Erik grew up in a society built around farming, trade, exploration, and violence. Iceland was beautiful, but life was harsh. There were limited resources. Families fought over land. Disputes could become deadly, and reputation mattered. Erik inherited his father's temper. According to the Icelandic sagas, he became involved in violent disputes of his own, and eventually, his actions pushed him too far. The man with the red hair. Erik became known as Erik the Red. The name was probably connected to his red hair, but later stories also associate it with his violent temperament. Whatever the exact reason, Erik was not a peaceful farmer. He was a man who had enemies, and eventually those enemies got what they wanted. Erik was declared an outlaw. He was given a limited period of exile. He had to leave Iceland. He could have sailed back to Norway. He could have tried to find another settlement. Instead, he looked west, sailing into the unknown, beyond Iceland. The North Atlantic became dangerous, cold, stormy, unforgiving. There were no modern maps, no navigation systems, no rescue ships waiting nearby. A wrong turn could mean death, but Viking sailors had spent generations learning how to read the ocean. They watched the sun, the stars, the direction of the wind, the movement of birds, the shape of the waves. And Erik sailed west, toward a land that Europeans knew almost nothing about. Eventually, he found it. A massive island, mountains, ice, deep fjords, and stretches of green land hidden between them. This was Greenland, the land of ice. The name sounds strange, because Greenland is famous for its enormous ice sheet. But Erik wasn't interested in the frozen interior. He explored the coastal areas, especially the sheltered fjords of the southwest. There, he found something unexpected: pasture, meadows, fresh water, land where livestock could survive. It wasn't paradise, but compared with Iceland's crowded settlements, it represented something else: opportunity. Erik spent his exile exploring the new land, and according to the sagas, he eventually returned to Iceland with an extraordinary story. He had found a land beyond the Western Ocean, a land where people could settle. But there was one problem. Convincing Icelanders to leave everything behind wouldn't be easy. The name Greenland. And this is where one of the most famous stories about Erik begins. According to the sagas, Erik deliberately called the country Greenland because he believed a pleasant name would attract settlers. It sounds almost like an ancient marketing strategy. Instead of saying, "I found a frozen wilderness at the edge of the world," he called it Greenland. Whether the name was really chosen purely to attract settlers is impossible to know with certainty. But the name worked. People became interested. Erik had discovered something valuable. Not gold, not silver, land. The Great Return. When Erik's exile ended, he returned to Iceland. But he wasn't coming back empty-handed. He had a story, a destination, and a plan. He began encouraging people to join him. Families were promised the chance to build new farms, to own land, to escape crowded settlements, to start again, and eventually, a fleet was assembled. Around 985 AD, according to the sagas, Erik led settlers west toward Greenland. But the journey would be brutal. Ships disappeared. Storms scattered the fleet. Not everyone survived, and those who reached Greenland were entering a world unlike anything they had known. The first Greenland settlements. The Norse settlers established two major regions: the eastern settlement in the south, and later the western settlement farther north. They built farms, raised sheep, kept cattle and goats, hunted seals and caribou, and adapted their lives to an environment that could turn deadly without warning. The settlement wasn't huge, but it survived, and eventually it became a real Norse society. Churches appeared, farms spread through the fjords, trade developed, and Greenland became connected to the wider Viking world. Erik had done something extraordinary. He had taken a group of people and planted a European settlement on one of the most isolated places on Earth. But Erik wasn't the most important person there. Erik had created the settlement, but his greatest legacy would come through his children, because one of them would sail even farther west. One of his sons would eventually hear stories of lands beyond Greenland, lands with forests, rivers, and unfamiliar shores, a place the Vikings would call Vinland. His name was Leif Erikson, and years later, he would take his father's journey one step further. The colony at the edge of the world. Greenland was never an easy place to live. The winters were brutal, the growing season was short, and the settlements were separated by enormous distances. Yet the Norse stayed. They built farms along sheltered fjords. They hunted, they raised livestock, they traded, and for generations their society survived. At its height, the Norse population in Greenland may have numbered several thousand, although modern estimates are lower than older figures. For a while, Erik's gamble had worked, but Greenland had another secret. Its position made it a gateway to the unknown, and Erik's family was about to discover just how far west the Viking world could reach. The son who looked west. Erik's son, Leif Erikson, grew up in Greenland. He was surrounded by stories of his father's voyages. But Leif wasn't satisfied with simply living in the settlement. He wanted to explore. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed toward Norway. There, he encountered the Christian king Olaf Tryggvason. Leif converted to Christianity, and eventually he returned toward Greenland. But according to the Icelandic sagas, his journey didn't go exactly as planned. One tradition says he was blown off course. Another says he had already heard stories about lands to the west from an Icelandic trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Whatever the exact sequence, Leif sailed west, and what he found would become one of the greatest Viking exploration stories ever told. Helluland! The first land they encountered was rocky and barren. Flat stones, mountains, almost no trees. Leif called it Helluland. Historians commonly associate Helluland with Baffin Island, although exact identifications remain debated. The Vikings continued south, and the landscape changed. Markland. Now there were forests, trees, wood, something Greenland desperately needed. They called the region Markland, Forestland, for people living in Greenland. This was an extraordinary discovery. Wood was valuable. It could be used for buildings, tools, ships, firewood, and almost everything else. But Leif continued farther south, until finally the landscape changed again. Vinland. They found fertile land, rivers filled with salmon, meadows, and according to the sagas, wild grapes. Leif named the region Vinland, Wineland. The Vikings spent the winter there. They built a settlement, explored the surrounding area, and gathered resources. But they weren't alone forever. The Norse encountered indigenous peoples. Later, Viking expeditions would experience violent clashes with local populations, and these conflicts would make permanent settlement extremely difficult. Still, the Vikings had done something extraordinary. They had reached North America, almost 5 centuries before Columbus. Archaeology eventually provided evidence that Norse explorers really did establish a settlement in North America. At L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists discovered remains of an 11th century Norse settlement. The stories were no longer just legends. Something had actually happened. Erik never saw America. And here's the fascinating part. Erik the Red, the man who began this chain of exploration, probably never made the famous journey himself. His son did. Leif became the explorer remembered for reaching Vinland. But without Erik, Leif's journey may never have happened. Erik created the Greenland settlement. Greenland became the launching point, and from Greenland, the Vikings reached North America. One journey led to another. The fate of Greenland. But Erik's greatest achievement wouldn't last forever. The Norse settlements in Greenland survived for centuries. Then, slowly, they disappeared. The western settlement declined first. The eastern settlement survived longer. The last known Norse record from Greenland dates to 1408. After that, the evidence becomes silent. By around the mid-15th century, the Norse presence had effectively disappeared. What happened? Nobody knows for certain. Climate became colder. Sea ice made travel more difficult. Trade changed. The European demand for walrus ivory declined, and the Greenlanders were living in an environment that had always been unforgiving. There may have been multiple reasons, but no single explanation completely solves the mystery. The settlement Erik had created eventually vanished. The legacy of Erik the Red. Erik began his story as an outlaw. He was expelled from Iceland. He could have disappeared into history as another violent Viking. Instead, he sailed west. He explored Greenland, founded a settlement, and created the conditions that allowed his descendants to explore even farther. His son reached North America. His family helped connect Iceland, Greenland, and the wider Viking world. Erik didn't conquer an empire. He didn't sit on a famous throne. He didn't lead the great heathen army. He did something different. He pushed the boundaries of where people thought they could live. The Viking who changed the map. The Vikings are often remembered as warriors, but Erik the Red reminds us that they were also explorers, sailors, farmers, settlers, and risk-takers willing to cross oceans that terrified everyone else. Erik left Iceland as an outlaw and created a settlement on the edge of the known world. His son sailed even farther and reached North America centuries before Columbus. But perhaps the strangest part of Erik's story is that the land he helped colonize eventually became a mystery again. The farms disappeared, the churches became ruins, the people vanished, and Greenland returned to silence. But the journey didn't end there, because somewhere between legend and history, the Vikings had crossed an ocean, reached another continent, and left behind a story that would survive for 1,000 years. Erik the Red didn't just discover a new land. He opened the door to a world beyond the edge of the map.